All right. Well, I'm very glad to be here with Ian Mosby, who I've connected briefly with online here and there, but this is our first chance to really chat in any kind of really meaningful way. And so I'm looking forward to that. I've read a few of the things you've written just recently, Facebook posts and stuff like that, and I just feel like there would be a good conversation there. And I
Good
was
to be.
wondering if for I'm glad to hear it. I'm not, maybe for those people who are watching, could you introduce yourself and a bit about what you do and where you're from and who you are and those sorts of
Okay.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm now in Hamilton in Ontario in Canada. So I'm here as a community missioner. So that's really trying to support and develop either contextual mission or church plants. Um, and particularly for me, drawing on Christian spirituality, and a lot about how do we equip the church to be relevant in a post-secular cultural context. Um, so my background, so I was a kind of radical atheist up to the age of 17, 18, 19, very unchurchy, and then became a Christian from some very early, what we would in the UK call fresh expressions of church, which for me was a combination of being dragged to the Taizé community, which is a kind of monastic inspired community in Burgundy in France, combined with all sorts of things were coming out of the emerging church and alternative worship at the time. And I was very much into the kind of whole dance culture when I was a late teenager. And so in New York, I had a really big experience of God as an atheist that really was part of my path towards finding faith. And so, yeah, I've kind of continued in a relationship to the Anglican Church, and got ordained later from that. And now I'm here, and I have a whole kind of background, not surprisingly, involved with a kind of new monastic sort of movement, because that kind of way of being Christian has been very, very deep for me. So yeah, so that's me.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. The monastic tradition has been very profound for me as well. I don't know how
Mm,
much you know about my background, but just super briefly, I grew up sort of a mixture of Quaker and neo-pagan hippies interested in indigenous spirituality kind of
mm,
blend there. I grew up on an organic farm um, with permaculture and herbs all around and that kind of stuff. I also sort of left my spirituality behind for the most part, never entirely throughout my teenage years, and was a nomadic anarchist punk rocker for a while, well, for a good 5 years. Um, and then I ended up finding my way back into ceremony. So I went to a lot of indigenous ceremony from when I was young. But I started working with an elder much more consistently and much more regularly in my early 20s and throughout my 20s. And he was sort of my Abba, so to speak, who I was his Skabewish, which means helper. Um,
mm.
and I'm still involved with that community in many ways, although I've largely transitioned into the Christian world, um, and consider myself a Christian now and write as a Christian. And yeah, but I still carry that with me, and I also still carry my Quaker background with me. I was very briefly a seminarian with the United Church of Canada.
Okay.
Um, I'm in Northern Ontario, up in Sudbury right now, but I was on Manitoulin Island for a long time, and I grew up near London, so not we're not too far from each
So
other.
far.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the monastic writings in the Christian tradition that really captivated me, especially at first the Cloud of Unknowing, but then a whole bunch of other stuff. So for
Mm,
sure, the new monasticism piece is interested something that I'm interested in.
yeah, so the new monastic thing is incredibly important. Well, it's part of my initial conversion formation and has continued to be incredibly important when thinking about what it means to be a Christian in a context of post-secular spirituality. So I think it's no coincidence. There's a deep resonance, I think, between like new monasticism as a way of being Christian and missional in a context where many people are spiritually seeking.
So what does that mean, the missional piece for you?
Well, I kind of it's very interesting, isn't it? I think one of the key motifs for my own faith was the mystery of the Trinity and about the relationality within the Trinity, which leans into some of the Celtic Christian spirituality as a basis, which touches into Orthodox spirituality. And we remember the Desert Mothers and Fathers, that whole, the Orthodox tradition comes out of the Desert Mothers and Fathers of the East. So for that, spirituality is incredibly important to me. Um, Partly not as out of any sense of romanticism, but I think for me it kind of started out with a sudden awareness with my parents that, and a lot of my kind of my older family, is everything was very external. There was no sort of interior life to the self, and so I was very aware that some of the difficulty of my grandfather was in Dunkirk in the Second World War, was in all the wrong places, and came back with very severe post-traumatic stress disorder, which really affected my mum and her siblings. And I think they had no frame of reference about interior life, about any of what that was about. Um, and they were very, I'm very grateful for that more left-wing inheritance of their experiences. But there wasn't this interiority. And I'm very aware that monastic spirituality, that more contemplative traditions, are all about the true self and about the sense of of that inner transformation. So missional for me is, I love that image in 2 Corinthians, I think in chapter 5, when it talks about the ministry of reconciliation. So the mission then is all about joining in with a God that's seeking to restore all things into right relationship with God. So it's restorative, it's healing, it's reconciling. It's not this trying to convert people. I think it's a very abused word, actually, missional. But actually, missional is actually about joining in with a missio Dei, or I prefer missio Trinitatis, the mission of the Trinity, which is restorative, which is about restoring all things, and about us joining in with God, as God seeks to restore things through love. So that is, for me, what the root of mission is, which is then about the mystery of being a Christian, which is about going ever deeper into relationship with God, and the mysteries around that. And for me, I'm very influenced by kind of monastic ideas of mission, drawing on the Benedictine, Franciscan, Ignatian, and Carmelite resources. For me, are quite important. But I would say that because I'm an Anglican, so that sort of stuff is deep in the DNA, this monastic spirituality. Yeah, so for mission is very much about that, as a God that seeks to restore all things back into right relationship with God, and therefore very important to me.
Yeah, well, that's very important to me too. Thank you for that definition. Growing up Quaker,
Mm,
mission wasn't quite a dirty word, but proselytize is very much a dirty word. Like people would say, don't proselytize me, or like we're Quakers, we don't proselytize. And so I very much always had this sense of like, we don't want to be missional, and Quakers have the idea the Spirit will lead people, to the society when they're called to be there.
mm,
Of course, Quakers have dwindling numbers, so I'm not sure how well that theory is necessarily working out. Um, but the way you framed it feels more like the ancient tradition of the active and the contemplative life,
exactly.
um, living in balance with each other, not as separate things. Some people call to, you might say, an emphasis on one or the other in particular. But for me, I think we always need at least some of both.
Mm. Yeah, that resonates with me.
Mhm.
Um, I think what I really like about the more contemplative is that mission is God's, not ours, and a lot about mission is about getting out of the way of God. It's not about forcing anything on anybody, but more about how can we be a resource for people as they pilgrimage in their own unique spiritual journeys, and how can we share wisdom as people journey, and engage with people's questions, and curate. For me, that's a really important word, missional curation as well. How do we curate opportunities for people to explore and transform and encounter God, in a non-manipulative way, which is incredibly important to me. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Mm. And I think the Quakers, I think it's very interesting how the Anabaptists, the Quakers, the Contemplatives, there's a lot of shared tradition there about about this not forced, this kind of to avoid power relationships in the name of mission, which so it's all about letting go of control, getting out of the way, allowing God to do what God will do, which I think is really healthy.
Yeah, that's definitely from the Quaker perspective, I think where that hang up over the idea comes from is the sense of sort of imposing ourselves on others or presuming that we know what's best for someone else. Um,
Mm.
but it sounds like that's not at all what you're talking about.
No, really not.
No, no, no. Of course. Uh, yeah. So then what would that look like in a new monastic sort of setting? Would that be sort of service work in the community? Would it be teaching and those kinds of things, or would there be for you an emphasis on the cultivation of virtue and that kind of side of the active life, or what do you think about that?
Well, this is, I think, where new monasticism, in some contexts, leans into the post-secular piece about culture. So when I was involved in the Moot community in central London in the UK, um, that became a really big commitment to form opening up meditation to stressed out people working in the financial district of London. Um, so lots around well-being and spirituality around well-being, um, and opening up prayer practices, spiritual practices for people to experiment with, if anything. And alongside that, the importance of dialogue and helping people. So one of the key things that we did as a new monastic community was to help people who were spiritual but not religious find a place where they can encounter some forms of Christian spirituality to resource their own spiritual questing, but also dialogue where, we would talk about things like, coming to terms with impermanence, what is depression, what is, how do we relate to the mystics, you name it was discussed in that, with a real opportunity about not winning an argument, but more about sharing wisdom and learning from these sort of encounters. So in that way, practicing that monastic call to generosity and sharing and offering of stability. I think. So I think the really thing I learned about the Moot community, which was tough. It was tough because we had no money and we were trying to run an arts cafe in the middle of a medieval building in the middle of central London, which now it was exhausting, but we managed to do it. But it was deeply rewarding because there were lots of people struggling with mental illness, addiction, lots of people working with unsustainable work patterns in that part of London. So this became a real opportunity around human flourishing and opening up the idea of Christianity in the context of love and well-being, which was a real privilege. And even in Hamilton now here, we run so one of the things I'm involved in is running another meditation group using the John Main approach, which is a really straightforward way of using meditation. And we've now got this thing called Hamilton Well here, and that again I think is drawing on the same thing where it's providing an opportunity for people who are unchurched spiritual seekers to explore and be part of some sort of regular form of meditation where there's no other thing other than joining in if you want to. No expectation of then you must go on to this or that or the other, which is what the Christian church has a terrible habit of doing, as some sort of commodified process. That this is deliberately seeking to be countercultural to the market society by opening up opportunities around Christian spirituality. So that goes very deep with me. So, and that's where I think that the new monastic communities, when they lean into having a depth of contemplative prayer, can use that quite missionally for those who are spiritually hungry in our world at the moment, which is in a right a mess, where everything's is kind of burning in many ways, and that sense of where people, many people, I think, are desperately seeking for significance and trying to work out who the hell they are in a market society that is far too focused on economics and materialism, that this gives an opportunity for kind of raw humanity. Anyway, I can bang on about that for hours, but that's the sort of thing. I think for me, it's about how do you open up Christian spirituality to those who are spiritually seeking. That is a key area for new monastic communities. Um, I think one thing I'm a bit concerned about is that when the church does anything in the name of mission, it's always social justice. It's never really about just practicing hospitality and being friendly and opening up Christianity to people. I think too many elements of the church feel that somehow they must be doing something at somebody or other, and I kind of want to resist that because it's exhausting, and I'm not sure it really helps everybody. I mean, social justice is important, but if that's all we do, then it doesn't really, for me, open up the gospel for people. Mm.
Yeah, that resonates for me very strongly. That was my experience with the United Church. I didn't have, other than my Quaker background, which is Christian, but it wasn't really that Christian. And the Canadian Quakers, a lot of them don't even call themselves Christians. Most of us probably that I know. Um, and so I didn't have the whole kind of church background and just sort of shopping around like what are the options here. And the United Church had the social justice values that I was able to align myself with, and they weren't excluding people and all that kind of stuff, and it was important to me. But then when I got to seminary, I found out that was just all they wanted to talk about ever, and I was like, well, I'm on board, but like, can't we talk about something else too, and maybe some prayer to go with that? And then people would sort of glaze over and not know. I shouldn't generalize. There were lots of wonderful people, and there still are there, but um,
Mm.
that missing piece of the to bring it back to what you said at the beginning, the interiority and the prayer. Um, I think we've almost in our post-secular society and in modernity in general have we've tried to excise all that from things. And when you read commentaries, even on some of the great church fathers or all the medieval mystics and stuff like that, people will almost be sort of trying to filter out all of the medieval junk and get down to some kind of good logical analytical idea that we can then you know um, pontificate about without having to actually practice anything. um, so
Exactly.
the practice piece for me was huge, and I was when I found the cloud, that was really important to me to see that Christianity did have a tradition of practice,
Mm.
and it's just been ignored in the circles that I happen to find myself in my time and place.
Yeah, I think the Enlightenment and modernity did a lot of damage to the church, and I think that some new monastic communities are a response to actually put back mysticism, mystery, spiritual practices that aren't all to do about thinking, um, uh, and rationalism. So I think it's a healthy counterbalance to that. Yeah, yeah. I don't really know how to be a Christian now if it's not with a deep commitment to community prayer, um, and worship, where mission is about deep relationality to God and relationality to other people, not just about relieving other people's distress, although that's important. But if it's just that, then we don't need the church. We just all become social services.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true. And I think we burn people out when we
Mm.
ask them to fight huge battles that
Yeah,
statistically individuals are unlikely to win on their own.
exactly.
And I think we set people up for failure sometimes with those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get burned out and then just sort of jump ship altogether.
Mm.
Um, I know
Yeah.
in my work as a spiritual director, I see a number of clergy who a very common story that I hear is that they don't feel like what God's called them to do is what they're actually doing, even though they went and got ordained and have a church and preach on Sundays and do all the things. They many people that I speak to find that there's something missing in it all, and that it's not quite what they felt called to, and they're sort of stuck with a overbearing bureaucratic role that they didn't want.
Exactly.
Um, but
Yeah. I mean, I'm very fortunate that my job, so I've done those sort of jobs, trying to turn around failing parish churches and all the bureaucracy that goes with that. Um, and for me, yeah, it's very difficult to make that sort of thing work, I think. So what I'm enjoying here is about freeing people up to be missions. So you have light structures, you have light governance, and the focus then is on freeing people up to go deep with one another, to live out that deep relationality. So you're not just exhausted by governance meetings and doing things at people, but more about what does it mean to enter into a life together that goes deep. And one of the joys of where I live here is that there was a parish church that ended a couple of years ago, and there's been a group of people, about 20 odd millennials, learning to pray together. And that is now growing into becoming a new monastic community where they'll make some sort of seasonal commitment before a bishop next year, this year, 2025. So that's a joy to see. Yeah. I think that new monasticism has the potential to bring a lot of renewal and new ways, or should I say, old ways of being church, back to life, in a more sustainable way, without, yeah, this. I mean, I just think some ways that we think about church are just not sustainable in a post-secular context.
I'm curious what you mean by post-secular. What comes after secular?
So yeah, that I think that's a deliberate. So this has been so I did a big research project looking at running a load of meditation groups and dialogue groups, engaging with the spiritual, not religious. Really, in that research project, wanting to understand who were the spiritual, not religious, and why are they attracted to Christian spirituality and that sort of thing, as part of their formation. And a big part of that I became very aware of was the fact that our culture in many parts of Western post-industrial nations, that many, I mean, in fact, the entire world now, I think, is affected by the combination of market societies, which are where consumerism, and the market literally has taken over whole societies. And I think Canada is a good example of that. North America is a very good example of that, combined with advances in information technology, which have got incredibly fast. So post-secularism basically is saying that um, we have moved from a culture defined by scientific rationalism, which was modernism, which we realized wasn't quite so great. And the recovery of individualism, and the recovery of a sense of self-determination through postmodernism as a more philosophical movement, to the post-secular, which basically says that we've realized that that we now live in a new society of even more greater plurality, where suddenly religions, spiritualities, and a host of other things all find a place in the market square, where suddenly people are interested in what religious leaders have to say, and where that secularizing process, which assumed that the church was just going to disappear and all religions were going to disappear as people became more enlightened, not only is not true, but actually that the exponentially opposite is increasing, where people are much more open to spirituality, possibly not so much to religion, but definitely to spirituality in ever increasing numbers. And so that's, I think there was some recent research done in various places. The number of people who are interested in prayer, probably in the 1980s, I think it was something like 15 to 20% of the population were interested in. Now it's gone up to 70 to 80% of people are interested in spirituality and prayer, but just not necessarily into church going. So I think so. Post-secular is basically saying that there are many spiritual seekers. Some of them have been very deeply wounded by the way we do society, because it's fast, it's dehumanizing, and it's incredibly difficult to find your place in a market society. And I think there is a crisis, there's a number of crises in post-secularism, but a big one is as a consequence of consumerism, that many people are trying to make themselves up, which leads to forms of addiction and mental illness, rather than trying to discover the true self. So I think a lot of post-secularism is about people realizing that we live in an unsustainable way, and that the way we do life is not healthy, and that the post-secular piece is about people who are committed to being spiritual seekers, which is a committed way to kind of seek significance in life. Yeah. So the spiritual but not religious are a very significant new social grouping in a post-secular context. Yeah. The other side of post-secularism, which I think is really important, then it digs into the market society piece, is that we see increasing forms of fundamentalism in religion and politics, um, which then do violence to complexity as people try to reduce the complexity of life. And on the back of the other piece of post-secularism, which is the darker side of it, is that in many places, because of high levels of immigration, there's more people moving around the planet now than there ever has before, in terms of immigration, that you end up with intolerant coexistence in many places. So the sense of breakdown of local society into lots of fragments of different people groups who don't really interrelate. So that's what post-secularism is largely about. And some of it came out of the writings of Charles Taylor, who never talked about post-secularism, but everybody started talking about post-secularism as a response to his writing on secularism. Yeah. So that's been a big part of my life. And I think part of my job is trying to help churches, Christians to understand what the culture is that they need to engage with, right? Because I think in many churches are so in a bubble that they haven't realized that we're not in a modern culture which is about atheism versus religion. Actually, increasingly, atheists are marginalized just as much as the religious. And actually, what we're seeing is the need for the church to relate to those who are spiritual seekers. Anyway, I'm banging on, but that's kind of, I think, how I see post-secularism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I not too long ago learned about meta modernism
Mm,
as a philosophical thing, which sounds like
it
it's
is.
in a similar ballpark.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call myself a meta modernist or anything because I don't fully understand the label, as with most of those sort of labels. But I think the general sense that we're moving from I I'm struggling with my words. I dislike the notion that there's a pre-modern world and a modern world because that lumps all of history before modernity into like one thing, as if, ancient Greece was the same thing as medieval China.
Yeah.
Um, but but there was this major shift that happened, of course, into modernity from whatever else you want to call it that happened beforehand, the rest of humanity's history. And I think it's kind of crumbling a little bit,
Mm,
um, ideologically, philosophically, materially, economically, politically.
yeah.
And and so then what's that next shift, whether it's meta modern or whether it's post secular or whether it's new monastic, whatever labels we want to give it.
Mm,
I feel like there's some kind of continuity with the past that we need to maintain that is also open and able to move into a world that our forebears couldn't have possibly imagined. Um,
yeah.
my entire community that we do online is entirely online, um, or almost entirely online. Sometimes people meet up, and we've had a couple of retreats, but for the most part, entirely happens online. And we're mostly people spread across the world. Not very many Canadians, mostly Americans, and a handful of Brits. And then a scattering of people just sort of all over the place. We have people come from Africa and Australia
Mm,
and India sometimes in different places, which is super cool and super interesting, but not something that any of the ancient monks could have ever imagined.
exactly. Exactly.
And to think that I have a mirror in my pocket, I can just pull it out and summon the wisdom of all the world, and I can communicate with people anywhere I want in real time. It would have been the stuff of wizardry and sorcery in the minds of anyone from, you know, most of uh, all time. And so whatever it is that we do has to be new, but I really don't want to lose that connection to what was old, which I think was, I don't know if it's modernity or post-modernity that did that or both, but um, whatever phase it happened in, I think it's happened in a sense that we almost reject. Like saying something is medieval is like saying it's stupid and backwards and hick. Basically, is the way that people use it, and they'll talk about, oh, medieval theology was all about how many angels could fit on the head of a pin or something. As if that wasn't an interesting question. It is an interesting question.
Mm, mm,
Um,
mm.
but we lump together 1,000 years and call it the Middle Ages and sort of scoff at it from our enlightened modern perspective. And I think if we're going to move forward in a good way, we almost need to mine that 1,000, 1,500 years. I mean, the ancient church too, that first 1,500 years of Christianity, and
Yeah.
and see what it is that they had that we don't, even
Mm,
as we realize what we have that they don't.
mm.
I don't know. Now I'm just banging on, as you said, but
No, no, you agree. I mean, that whole ancient future perspective for me
yeah.
is critical. Uh,
Mhm.
I find it really interesting. When I was in a new monastic community in central London a while ago after Moot, I found this book which was by a French translator who got all the writings of Desert Mothers and Fathers and written into quite and some lengthy books. And fascinating how a lot of that wisdom resonates with now and how accessible that sort of thinking is. So yeah, I completely agree with you. This kind of ancient resourcing the future, where we again have a confidence to engage in other modes of understanding other than just rationalism. Um, I like this idea of this trans rationalism, this kind of more experiential, wisdom-based ways of understanding and knowing that the Desert Mothers and Fathers were really all about. So, yeah, I'm excited about the fact that we're able to draw on the ancient to inform the now and the future. There's something really healthy about that.
And I guess it's a privilege that is sort of a postmodern privilege or a post-secular, whatever
Mm,
time we're in now, privilege. That I can just. The other day, I was watching a YouTube video and someone mentioned Saint Ephrem the Syrian, and I've been writing about Genesis, and so I was like, oh, I want to read that, and I just
mm,
pulled out my phone and I hit buy now, and it showed up the next day on my doorstep, a scholarly translation at an affordable price of Saint Ephrem the Syrian. But that's a
mm.
miraculous thing that no generation prior has ever had,
Absolutely.
and so in a way we've forgotten so much, but in a way we also have so much more access than anyone ever has to read things in our own language. We don't have to learn Latin and Greek and all this kind of stuff and hope that we're able to get into a university or something like that. But um, now just a common person can pick up John Cassian and read John Cassian if they want to.
Mm,
Um, and I think that there's something really cool about that. And I'm not sure how. I mean, for me, that's how new monasticism has come into my life, just by the fact that I could follow one thread to another, and all these books were available, and I could just buy them and read John Cassian. Um,
yeah. Yeah.
and there's something really cool about that.
Mm,
But,
mm. Yeah, and alongside that, that suddenly these very ancient prayer practices, like
mhm,
some of that monastic, some of that mystical of different traditions, suddenly really help earth people in their humanity and open up a way of connecting with God that people could not imagine before. So I really like that. I mean, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming because there is so much out there that it can like be completely stunting about where the hell do you start. But I think at the same time, as you say, making these things much more accessible, really, I'm excited about. So one of the big things we did when I was in Moot, we put up a lot. We kind of took a look at all of these ancient prayer practices, created some audios, put them up on a website and put labels on it so that people could find it in terms of well-being, and they had literally hundreds of thousands of hits because people found them deeply resourcing, um, and that is exciting when that happens. Mm, yeah,
so I'm curious. Can I ask you a more personal new monastic
yeah, of
question?
course you
Yeah.
can.
What does new monasticism look like for you in a day to day? Do you have a personal rule? Do you follow a anything like that? Or
So
yeah.
I'm part of something called the Society of the Holy Trinity, which was set up to try and support small, localized new monastic, missional new monastic communities of an Anglican DNA around the world. And within that, there is some seasonal vows where communities and individuals make commitments to. And so that goes very deep with me. So I am, committed to those practices and a rhythm of life. that comes out of that. Um, uh, and I desperately need it. I mean, part of these spiritual practices are incredibly important for me. So in the last year, both my parents died in unexpectedly in a short period of time, which was catastrophic for me. At the same time, when I moved abroad, so this was not an easy time. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have held it together if I didn't have this kind of committed rhythm and committed contemplative practice. I think I would have lost it. Um, Even now, it's a bit touch and go with grief and things, but uh, I have found this way of praying and earthing oneself deeply critical for my own mental health. I think I have a kind of a background anxiety. Has always been my sort of curse, and but this way of life is utterly liberating for me, and it helps me to be who I really am, not that just trying to survive. Yeah, I think so. New monasticism, I think for me, really helps me be my true. I think Thomas Merton talks about the difference between a true self and false self. The false self, where we're just making ourselves up, or through egoic, desire for power or materialism and all the rest. Um, by letting go of all of that and trying to be committed to a way of life which is seeks to be deeply immersed in God's love, that is liberating for me. And I found it so deep that I can't imagine not being leaning into that sort of new monastic sort of basis. No, it's so in my DNA. Yeah, so very important to me. Yeah. So yeah, so some of that's around spiritual practices, some of that's around the practice of mission, some of that's about community. So there is like something. One of the communities here is one of the communities of the Society of Trinity. So that's lovely that I can be part of that. And again, like you described, there is an online presence to this society where we meet up to do stuff online as well as locally, so that we have the ability to be transnational as well as be a community across the world, as well as being localized in a particular place. Um, so I'm very, very grateful for that, really. And not that we've got, there are 1,000 different ways of being new monastic, I think. And this is just one expression of it, which I have really, really, really valued for a long time now. Mm.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've been trying to, over the last maybe 5 years or so, uh, figure out what my. I realized I have a call to a monastic life. I also have a call to family life,
Mm.
which I don't think needs to be a problem, but of course
Mm.
raises difficulties in terms of scheduling and stuff like that. How much time do I have for prayer? I have a baby right now. He'll be 2 in
Mm.
March, which means I used to have a daily practice of dedicating an hour every morning to a combination of prayer, silence, writing, reading, um, following Pelagius's teaching to dedicate the best hour of the day to God,
Mm.
and to go into a quiet, secluded place and find peace and study the scriptures and stuff. And I found that to be a good rhythm for quite a while until I had a baby. And then now that doesn't happen at all. It hasn't happened in quite some time anyway.
Mm.
But I do still have little daily practices that I thank all the things that I eat. Um, and I just remember each thing. I say thank you wheat, thank you water, thank you pig, thank you um, ketchup, tomato. I guess I would say I try and remember ingredients. Um,
Mm.
and little things like that I find help to ground me back into the sort of routine of I'm a stay-at-home dad. My wife's the primary. She goes to work full time, and I stay at home. And there's something about that that makes my cup of coffee. It reminds me when I'm thanking the coffee beans and the water and the sugar cane and the cow and the cream, um, to stop and I don't do an hour, but I do a good 30 seconds or something like that, So I guess I've switched from Pelagius to Brother Lawrence and since having a new baby.
Mm.
But I think there's something about habits, about having habits of prayer, um, and routine that even if it changes as life changes, that it supports us, like you said. And for sure, that's true for me very much.
Yeah, I think there's seasons for things, and I think being contemplative and being a parent of an under five is a real challenge. But I think it's finding different creative ways around that rhythm, which I think is possible. Um, and then I think also with new monastics, it's really being really careful not to get too purist. You know, the musts are
Mhm,
not helpful. It's about working out sustainable rhythms. I think it's critical.
mhm.
Uh, Otherwise, I think some of the real mistakes with some new monastic communities are when they set the bar too high, which is just not sustainable. Um, and I've certainly seen some communities really burn out from having unmeetable expectations. And I think that's not helping anybody.
For sure. I'm trying to remember which of the Desert Fathers it was. It was either Anthony or Poman. I think it was Anthony. There's a saying of Abba Anthony that someone was out hunting who wasn't a monk and noticed all these monks sitting around and eating and having a nice meal and laughing with each other. And he comes over and he asks Abba Anthony, he says, I thought you guys were all like real serious, stern monks here, like you're supposed to be fasting. What are you doing? He says, well, take your bow and draw an arrow back. And so the guy does, and now he says, okay, now take another arrow, do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And the man says, well, if I do it too many times, my bow will break. That's not wise. And he said, well, so it is with my monks. If I push them too hard, they'll break.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
so even someone as austere as Abba Anthony or Pullman, whichever it was, both of them were very austere. Still recognized that there was that importance of balance
Yeah,
and reasonable goals, attainable desires,
absolutely.
yeah, moderation.
Yep.
I think
Yep.
one of my favorite stories of that comes from Cassian. Um, it was actually because when I first started to think about like what's my rhythm going to look like, I wanted to honor Lent and Advent more than I had in the past. Um, and I started with Lent because it was sort of the more obvious one to know what to do with for me for some reason. Fasting's familiar with indigenous ceremonies, so I've done a lot of fasting and ascetic practices in my spiritual formation. And then I thought, well, I want to fast for Advent because that's, like when I read the old Celtic monks, they were fasting for Advent as well as Lent. But I came sort of a hard, abrupt face with my culture and my family and my society in which I live, which is that Advent is not a season of fasting. Right? Advent is the season of fruitcakes. And I found myself not wanting to be rude to my family and friends and people, and especially for a part of this time, I was the minister of a church, and so every Sunday in Advent, I left home with like 10 bags of cookies and cakes and everything, right? And I didn't want to tell all these sweet little old ladies who have done this very kind and generous thing, no, 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 like I'm fasting, I'm too, thanks, that's I can't have that. It felt wrong. And then I was reading through Cassian at some point in his institutes, and he gives another story, kind of like that other one, where for anyone who doesn't know, John Cassian wandered the deserts in Egypt with one of his buddies, meeting a bunch of different desert fathers and mothers and recording their sayings and stories and teachings. Um, and later on, a good while later, writing some really important books about it. But as he was wandering around visiting all these monks, he noticed that they would always break their fast every time he arrived, and he was feasting more than he was fasting because he was a visitor. And so every time he'd arrive at a cell, they'd break their fast and they'd eat with him. And he was sort of upset because he wanted to be an austere monk and he wanted to fast lots. And he said, "Why are you giving me this olive oil or whatever it was in the story?" And one of the fathers said to him, making reference to that scripture, and I can't remember where it is in the Bible offhand, but where Jesus says, "When the bridegroom is present, they do not fast. When the bridegroom is gone, they will fast again." And the Abba told Cassian that he was the face of Christ here before him, and it's not fair. It's not appropriate for me to fast while you're here. When you're gone, I will fast again. But while you're here, I will celebrate with Christ who is before me. And I thought, what a touching story, and also what a helpful thing for me to remember during Advent. That um, that honoring the Christ in the other is more important than my fast, is as important as my fast maybe, and it is. But yeah.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah, you're reminding me about Advent and Lent. Reminded me um, that one of the key things I think, thinking about what we were saying earlier, is that I don't know why, but one thing that's been lost when thinking about the ancient understanding is about how our lives get caught up in these patterns of awakening, purgation, illumination, and union
Yeah.
as processes. And the liturgical year is supposed to be a reflection of that. Um, and we just have forgotten about all of that whole process of this rhythm that happens in life. Um, and so it's something about recognizing these patterns of awakening, purgation, illumination, union are really, really, really critical as people journey in their spiritual lives. Um, and one of my great sadnesses is that many Christians don't know how to help people spiritually explore because they have no idea what we're talking about. They got the idea of awakening or the idea of becoming Christian, but all this idea around suffering, illumination, and this idea about this mystical union with God just gets lost. So, um, what I think is good about new monastic community, drawing on some of the ancient wisdoms of the Desert Mothers and Fathers, is actually reminding people of that reality. Um, and that was a big part of what I did with that research project I did for my PhD, was thinking about how can you have opportunities for people to explore Christianity much more apophatically by engaging with all sorts of prayer practices and wisdom learning as they, I think John Cassian is a really good example of that type of approach to formation and what we know of him around resourcing people through these various stages of faith. So I attempted to write a book about that, which is going to get published in 3 weeks' time, which I'm ridiculously overexcited about. So yeah,
Okay. Can we
yeah,
deep dive into that idea?
yeah.
Because I write about the triple way all the time,
Mm,
the purgation, illumination, union, or purification, illumination, perfection, depending on the translations and the original language. I haven't heard the awakening at the beginning as a fourth, so that's interesting. I'd love for you to talk about that.
mm.
And just to say, I'm actually writing a book right now, which I'm not sure when it's going to be finished, but I'm hoping to have it out in 2025. Hopefully, at the beginning, some first few months of 2025, if I can.
Right.
Um, that's sort of my in-depth look at the purification stage, the purgation stage, the first, in
Mhm.
my understanding of the three stages, the first stage.
Right.
And I hope to write a book for each of the other two as well. Maybe a hexameron for the illuminative stage and something very short and succinct for the the unitive stage.
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, you piqued my interest with that. I'd love to hear what it was your PhD dissertation about, and what's your book about, and how do you incorporate that path, that pedagogical formative path?
So what I found really, really interesting was, well, first of all, it started off okay. So we're doing all these meditation groups and we're doing all these kind of dialogue groups for engaging with spiritual seekers with this idea about how do we resource people to journey deeper in their own pilgrimage. And then so I started to try and reflect on that theologically after thinking about what was that sociologically in terms of spiritual, not religious. And what I found fascinating, and I started to read a number of different things. I think it started off with reading Charles Taylor, and he talked about three stages. I think he called it the below. Oh my gosh, I can't remember. There was like kind of like a suffering below stage, a middle stage, and this kind of more unitive stage. So he came out with these three stages again, as you described it. Then I started reading a kind of Protestant writer around the idea of theosis, and then these kind of three stages emerged again. And then I read a compatriot of C.S. Lewis, whose name is now escaping me, not Barman, but it sounds like that, um, who again talked about these three stages of purgation, illumination, and union. I think, okay, this is really interesting. Everything I'm reading seems to correlate about the importance. And Thomas Merton, of course, was another one who talked about that. So I thought, okay, there is something really coming together here. Um, And then with Thomas Merton, there was a real emphasis on awakening as an additional fourth. So then I started listening to the stories. So I had to interview 32 spiritual, not religious people as part of this research, as part of an ethnographic study. And without failure, these four different stages of spiritual development kept occurring again and again and again and again, and in some of the more mystical theology that I was reading. And so I think, okay, so this is really interesting because it offers a more contemplative way of understanding what's going on in mission, which starts with the Spirit of God awakening people to the reality of God. Um, and that can either be in lots of little epiphany moments or having, like Thomas Merton did, an enormous experience of the divine on the streets in the city he was at the time. So that awakening thing becomes a really important first step that that is quickly followed by purgation in the sense of, you know, unfortunately, we get excited by the awakening of the presence of the divine, which then deeply reminds of our own brokenness and attachments and all of that. And then we end up with that kind of purgation stuff, which is often about pain, trauma, illness, and holding on to harming things that we've had and not knowing what to do about it. And often where we grip very, very tightly, which is purgation. And there's something about listening to people like John of the Cross about letting go and this idea of surrender and being able to let go of these things to and often that's around materialism as well as hurts and all the rest of it, that then leads into a moment of illumination as we seek to follow God into freedom and healing, and then comes the stage that I think um, for many is where they have the opportunity then to choose to want to be Christian or becoming in Christ, which then leads into mystical union or theosis. So yeah, I was very, very struck that there were these two things. There was this kenotic love of God, this unconditional love of God that God puts out um, to all people, and there's kind of this yearning of the spirit for us to journey towards God, and the idea that we can have a theotic response in the desire to go deeper with God. So there's this balance of kenosis and theosis through these stages. Um, and on the back of that, I then tried this kind of more apophatic way of helping people explore all of that that seemed to be very useful. And that's basic. So that's what the book is, which I think I called, yeah, a seeking heart, a more contemplative approach to mission and spirituality. And that comes out. So that's a mixture of research findings plus trying to open up these very ancient practices that we're talking about and giving some really practical ways of helping people explore these things. Yeah. So that's what the book is. Um, and I can't wait for it to be out because it's nearly killed me trying to write it because it's like, yeah, I've got a very fierce copy editor, which is very good, but I'm not that great at detail, and they are scrupulously on my case about. And I think I've got one final edit to do tonight that I've got to get done before I go to bed, and then that'll be it, and
Oh
that'll be
wow.
that's what that book is, and that follows the series because I did write another book previously about Trinitarian spirituality, which was very important to me and in my new monastic search. And there's been a couple of other books that I've edited, which are a load of missional practitioners looking at different aspects, and one of those is on new monasticism too. So anyway, so this is the yeah this is the book that comes after about 8 years worth of hard grind. So I'm be glad when that finishes. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Well, congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank
I
you.
I'm interested in that. That's cool.
Mm,
Yeah, the idea of the triple way or the threefold path, which are the names I usually give for it,
mm,
it really struck me when I first found it. I think it was one of the things that I had found missing. Like I knew it was missing, but I didn't know what it was in the Christian tradition. There was like an empty spot
mm,
in terms of the pedagogy of spiritual formation outside of learning doctrines and catechesis and whatever. Because there's plenty of formation out there for learning the doctrines and all that stuff, of course. But the when I was in ceremony, I mean, there was a real sort of it wasn't super rigid, but there was very much a sense of like you're not ready for that yet. You still need to focus on this. Where do you start? And we had seven grandfather teachings, which led from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and again, not in a rigid way, not in a constrictive way, but just in a way that if you don't know where you're supposed to go, you can kind of look for a bit of direction in something where there's a sort of collected wisdom of the past that says, a lot of us have found that if you're in that spot, then maybe a good spot to look at is this one over here.
Mm.
And and I found that in the threefold path, and I think it's really become the foundation of sort of all of my teaching and my approach to monasticism in my own life and in the way I write about it. And the book I'm working on now has the working title of Inner Peace, Contemplation in Celtic New Monasticism. So the idea is for it to be sort of modeled on a handful of ancient and medieval books, sort of like Cassian's Institutes in a way, to be the beginning, the first book. And I even use the same structure. So I talk about the outer person first and then the inner person, just like Cassian does in the Institutes, and try to follow all those patterns of monastic formation in the way that I structure it. And
Brilliant.
for me, the stage of purification is I think purity has gotten a rough word in our modern culture because it gets associated with purity culture and
Mm.
aspects of the Christian world that I'm unfamiliar with growing up Quaker, about sexual no-nos and cultural taboos and other such things. And that's what purity means for a lot of people. But I think if we take it back to what it really means, if you think of water, if you have muddy water, it's not just water, it's water mixed with some other junk. And when we purify the soul, it's the same idea that we're removing all the other junk, and what's left is the pure soul, the pure water. Uh, so for me, it's not sort of like we were qualifying missional for those who are hearing it in a certain lens. The purification stage or purgation for me is not at all about cultural taboos, and very much about a literal purifying of the soul, of removing all the junk
Mm.
and accumulating virtues and renouncing vices and all that good stuff. I like to write about those things. I find that helpful.
Mm.
Uh, and then the illuminative stage is in the writers I read, which I do a lot of the sort of heavy Neoplatonic guys like Dionysius and Eriugena and stuff. There, I'm big into them.
Mm.
Um, and for them, the illuminative stage would be about encountering God through creation, through the rational investigation of nature, through which we see the fingerprints of God and the necessity of God and all that sort of philosophically, which I think is beautiful and good as long as it's not all we do. Um, but also encountering God in the created world and sort of going outside of ourselves into others, into everything else that's out there, and allowing that to illuminate our minds. Um, Eugenia says that it's about seeking out the hidden causes of things and uniting and dividing them at the same time, which I find to be this wonderful little cone almost. Um, and then the unitive stage, the stage of perfection in Dionysius, which means not making mistakes and having a white picket fence, but perfection in this case means, as I imagine and I'm saying for others, but the fulfillment of purpose and completion of who and what we are. Um, which you could call theosis or deification. And so for me, those are the three stages, and I find myself mostly in the purification stage, with
Most
with
people do. Yeah.
like half a foot into illumination when I'm writing. Sometimes I can really feel the flow and all that, and I can and it's there. And I've had glimpses of the apophatic, of the radiant darkness of the unitive stage. Fleeting, momentary glimpses from a distance, but it gives me something to structure my thought around and to structure my practices around.
Mm.
I think that's good.
critical. And I think particularly about helping to have prayer resources and practices, particularly for the stage of purgation, is incredibly important.
Mhm.
Because there's not, yeah, we under support people when they go through those difficult dark night of the soul. And I worry about it quite a lot that, we leave, we tell people to go and see a doctor when they're really struggling. We never actually help people to think about prayer practice which will help you to alleviate stress through surrender. And surrender practices which I think are critical for for coping with stages of, particularly when people go through an extended time of difficulty with purgation, um, is incredibly important. um, I totally respect your language around purity. I think I also have the hangover of fundamentalist Christianity, which is obsessed with sexual purity to the point of patriarchal nightmare. So, but I hear what you're saying, because you're right. There is a kind of restorative healing process. Um, um, and I also don't think we're very, very good about explaining what it means to be in Christ, and that kind of whole process of going much deeper in relationship with God. I think in too many church traditions, you become a Christian, apparently you just coast for the rest of your life, which I don't think is at all reality. And it's much more about these reoccurring patterns, and this whole kind of threefold stage, as you say, it is going to keep happening whether you like it or not.
Mhm.
Um, Augmented by going through life and life stages and all the rest of it, and aging and all the rest of it. And we're very, very bad at helping people know how to do those things. So I will look forward to reading your book with some clarity. And I think there'll be a lot of connections between our two writings, actually. So I'll be
It
really
sounds
interested
like it. Yeah, that's
in
cool.
these.
I didn't know that going
That's
into this
exciting.
conversation.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. No, I think you're right about we are under resourced
Mm,
in the purgative stage.
mm,
And in my own experience, I won't go into the details, but I actually myself have severe PTSD. Um, and I was in seminary when it first started to surface, because as these things often do, it takes years sometimes
mm,
for them to surface. And so I was a seminarian. We did a field trip that triggered me, and I came back and we had like a class discussion about it, and I broke down in tears and cried a whole bunch, and ran out of the room, just a complete and utter wreck. And the
mm,
TA came out and patted me on the shoulder and said, "It's okay to have feelings," and that was the entirety of the support I got from the seminary. Um, and then I went and then I told my conference assessment team, they used to call it, who were supervising my ordinancy process and my student placement, because I had a no, I didn't have a student placement yet at that point, but and I broke down and I cried and I told them about it, and they all just sort of like looked awkward and suggested, "Why don't you go see a therapist?" And it's like, that wasn't bad advice. Like, it's, I'm not against therapy at all. Um, but they could have also,
mm.
given me some prayers to say and
Absolutely.
something
Yeah.
to get at what was going on, instead of just sort of going, ah. But they didn't have the resources. They didn't know. They don't know. No one ever taught them either. And so I think
Yeah.
you hit the nail on the head, that's sorely needed.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's why I really do think that's what's de-churching our churches.
mhm,
Because soon as people have significant problems, um, people are, there's an awkwardness, and people are just told to think good thoughts, and as you say, go and see a therapist and take medication. And it's not seen that this is an authentic part of the spiritual journey.
mhm,
It's seen as somehow you've lost your way. And I'm like, no, this is
mhm,
absolutely part of the spiritual journey. And yeah, it breaks my heart when I see so many people leaving churches because they find them deeply unresourcing when life is hard.
mhm,
And not hope, and all this tradition that goes back thousands of years is utterly lost.
mhm.
Yeah, makes my blood boil a bit, actually, to be honest.
It
You
does
know,
for me too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's just like, no, well, that's got to stop. And particularly now, where we're becoming very aware of a greater understanding of the effects of trauma, where PTSD has been one of them. But this idea that trauma gets passed down, we're starting to learn about how people become receptacles not only of their own trauma, but their parents' trauma and their parents' trauma, um, as well as the dehumanizing effects of modern life. And that, that's one hell of a shitstorm of trauma to face. And so now we must lean into the contemplative. I don't think that's a coincidence. That there is no way, I think, of surviving as a Christian without attending to that deeply, um, and not just told to, you know, avoid what you feel, avoid the inner life, but actually you have to face it. And it's sad to me that church is actually having to learn this from the 12-step movement when it was, the contemplative and monastic resources that helped form the 12-step movement in the first place.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, we're violently agreeing that it's so important.
Well,
And yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it was one of the things that I noticed such a stark contrast with from my experience in ceremony. Um, because the indigenous communities, as I'm sure you know, have, a great deal of intergenerational trauma.
exactly.
Um, and crying was a normal part of ceremony. Like it would be weird if you did like a big ceremony, not like maybe just one or two people, but if you've got like 50 people, like a whole community's coming together for a ceremony and there aren't any people crying, especially like the old grandmas who know how to pray the best, they cry the most, they know how to pray the best. And your tears were always seen as like medicine, as a healing. Um, and I actually spent a good portion of my spiritual formation praying to creator, to God, that I learn how to cry because I didn't know how to cry. I had all these hard walls up around me, and I was a soft, gentle person in the way I was with someone else, but I never let myself cry. I didn't even know how to cry. I didn't stop myself from crying. It was just all shut down. Um, and so then when I was in these situations I described and I cried and everybody was shocked and not in like a good way and I was so thrown off because I was like I was with my bishops, my like the people who were supposed to be helping me, and in my mind I was like, oh, I'm with the elders, I can cry now, and they'll help me, and that's not the way anyone else saw the picture at all, and it was a very like a startling moment for me to realize like, oh, wait a minute, there's something deeply missing here that
It really is.
that I'm the one who's crying right now, but you guys are the ones who should be. Kind of
Totally,
what I was thinking to myself.
totally. And and again, I think it's going back to Charles Taylor, is what you experienced there is the effect of this immanent cultural frame, where everything in churches so often is determined by modernism that's got absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, that does my head in, so
Mhm,
this stiff upper lip, more business type approach
mhm,
to being a ecclesial community, um, is just so inauthentic. Um, and Yeah, and there's no surprise that the church is dying on its feet when it's so sold out to things that don't have much to do with the Christian tradition. And it breaks me, yeah, oh, breaks my heart. I'm very, very lucky that I have the reason why I came from the UK over to here is because I wanted to work with a bishop that gets this stuff that we're talking about. And I've got a bishop here who really does. And that's why I literally came, what is it, 8,000 miles to come and do something here, because I wanted to really lean into this in a way that the people above me in terms of accountability understood this, so that I could get on with this, in a way that was, more authentic. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I came here. Um, and the church in the West is, that I think there is a kind of there's almost like something needs to die to allow this stuff to be refound, to then be much deeper and more in the DNA of what we mean to be Christian in the 21st century. Yeah, we have to let go of all this imminent cultural frame because it's going to kill us unless it does. Yeah. So Charles
mhm.
Taylor wrote about all of that, which I found very, very helpful. Mm.
Yeah, I haven't read any modern people on that specifically, but there's certainly lots of stuff about the gift of tears,
Yeah,
all throughout the tradition. And
exactly.
to go back to Cassian again, as one always should. Um, he's got a whole sort of
Mm,
treatise on the gift of tears, and he says, "Don't go seeking out crying, but when it comes, thank God,
mm,
it's a gift. It was seen symbolically as a baptism to wash away sin and sorrow."
mm.
Um,
Yeah,
and even when they have their lists, in the ancient and the medieval worlds, these lists of vices and stuff that, again, we often scoff at, but were actually like they were trying to be develop therapeutic modalities in their own
yeah,
time and place.
they really were.
Yeah, yeah, especially the Irish who really got that whole healing by contraries thing down to this really science, with a lot of flaws in it because it was the early Middle Ages, but there's a lot of beautiful stuff there too. But yeah, even in these lists of vices, they'll include sadness as one of the vices, and the and we have a modern sort of prejudice against vice as a moral failing. But when they say it's a vice, they just mean it's an affliction of the soul, that sadness can hurt us and we can suffer from it. But
Yeah,
they always, in every single treatise I've ever seen on discussing the vice of sadness, they always start with, don't get confused. There's also a virtue of sadness. There's also the gift of tears, and make sure that you allow it. And
yeah,
um, we could remember something about that, I think.
yeah,
But, mm,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well,
Mm.
maybe that's how the post-secular world will come together. Is we'll all just cry a lot, and then it'll all just sort of come together.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I think that commitment to, authenticity and vulnerability is critical, I think. And then tears, we don't need to be, and I think that's one of the other thing I think that is about shame, isn't it? There's a big, particularly with male spirituality, there's a real sense that somehow crying and emotions is weak. And I long for the day when all that dies, and then we get to this deeper sense of humanity, which is all about emotionality matters, um, and and that connection between inner and outer, is critical. Yeah, yeah. And I think the crisis that we have at the moment, and I'm experiencing this quite deeply in Hamilton here, that as well as homelessness, there is a drug addiction crisis, a homelessness crisis, and a mental health crisis. And a lot of that mental health crisis is that all these kind of traditions, spiritual traditions that really root you and help you in times of difficulty are not known. Um, and so, yeah, that the more that as Christians we can inhabit these things with deep wisdom, the more that we can then share those as resources that help everybody, not just us. And that's got to be a good thing. Yeah. Which is why I think there's 202 people who are part of this meditation and beer thing that we do in the cathedral here every Thursday. Yeah.
so you have 200 people in person coming
Uh,
to meditate at the
and
cathedral.
you don't get 200 all in one go, but there are 200
Yeah.
people who are part of that online community, and none of
Mm,
those, very few of those are Christian.
mm,
Most of those are spiritual, not religious, who are so excited about the fact there is a place to find community and well-being and spirituality, which is a rare thing. And it doesn't cost anything because we're not charging anybody for it. Right. So all of that I think is so, so, so important. Yeah. Thinking about where we started this conversation. Yeah. And I think as Christians now more than ever, we have a real duty and responsibility to help people, in faithfulness to people like Thomas Merton, really open up what it means to be human again, um, and drawing on this contemplative resource to help us do that is critical. So I think that where before mission was all about conversion or about right thinking, and helping people engage with religious questions. Now I think it's about helping people to really discover a fuller sense of what being human is about. When people are asking that question, how the hell do we live in such a complex world? I think that's critical for new monastics, particularly to focus in on. Mm, mm.
'cause it is so complex. Do you ever watch The Good Place? Have you ever seen that show?
I've seen a good place. Yeah,
Yeah, that's such a good
slightly
show.
irritates me, but yeah, yeah,
I think it's brilliant. I love that
yeah,
show. Um, but there's one of the points they make in it that there's this system. So for those who haven't seen the show, spoilers, I'm sorry, but they're tallying in this very sort of like almost caricature of heaven and hell, where you get points every time you do something good and points every time you do something bad, and you get a score at the end. And when you die, you go to one or the other. And
Hmm.
the system used to make more sense, before modernity, when everything was really basic. Like if you bought a potato, it was just a potato. But now in modernity, when you buy a potato, you've got to wonder who grew this potato, what country was it grown in, what pesticides were used on it, what's the environmental impact of this potato, what are the social implications of the how well were the workers paid and all this stuff. And it
Yeah.
turns out that in the show that no one gets into heaven anymore because everything's so interconnected and complicated that you can't
No
even
one
buy
gets.
groceries without hurting somebody.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that's really, they make it this funny kind of thing, but it's so true.
Is
Growing up Quaker, we have this real emphasis on our way of life um, as being a ministry and a social justice. And the Quaker gray, if you see, for those of you who've seen the guy on the oatmeal box, and it's all in gray. The idea was that actually Quakers stopped buying dye back in the day for their clothing because it was produced by the slave trade, vaguely speaking, and they had ethical concerns, and so they decided to just no longer dye their wool. And that's what you get when you don't dye your wool, is something vaguely gray. um, and I want to live that life, but when I find myself trying to, I don't know how to do anything, and I don't know how everything comes wrapped in plastic. Everything destroys the environment. I don't have any options in front of me to choose that are ethically sound. It's a moral conundrum,
yeah.
and I think it can eat us up a little bit. That, and knowing about all of the terrible things in the world that are happening all the time. There have always been wars all around the world, all over, but we didn't used to know about them all. We only knew about the wars that were happening with us. And not that I want to be ignorant with my head in the sand or something like that, but to be inundated on the news and social media constantly with all the atrocities happening everywhere, I think I think that's another point of the post-secular piece the ancient monks just couldn't have
No.
predicted, that we have to be creative in how we engage ourselves in the world and the news and in international affairs and care about politics and stuff,
Mm.
while not allowing it to overwhelm us, because we don't have the capacity to emotionally be invested in every war in the world at once. It overwhelms us and it destroys us. And so I
Yeah.
don't know what the balance is there, but I think a wise new monasticism will have to teach people to find it, to
Yeah.
find that balance somehow.
Totally. I mean, there's a lot of evidence talking about the how deeply traumatizing it is for people to be constantly in the flows of negative news around war and natural disaster, and the immediacy of watching people suffering constantly is really not good. But as you say, we don't want to be ignorant, but also we don't want to just keep re-traumatizing everybody the whole time. Mm. I was really fascinated by something I read the other day that talks about, and I don't know if you know the book series and the film Dune, um, but that has been said as being hugely popular with, they call it the most post-secular film there's been, and there's because it's desert, its community, its spiritual practices, it's the mystical, and there was a lot of writing saying, well, this is that type of film would never been filmed the way that it has now. If it would like 10 years ago, it would have been caught up in modernity and post-modernity. Well, this is really post-secular because it's all about the sacred in the ordinary, and where before it would have been the sacred over here and the ordinary over here, there's a sense of the integration of that, and that deep spiritual thirst and hunger is why this film has been so successful, these 2 months. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so it's actually increasingly, I'm thinking TV and film. My one hope is that they are targeting those who are hungry for spirituality, and hopefully that will start to reorder the world in a more hopeful disposition and a recovery of our sense of our common humanity. So I thought that was really interesting, that even though things are really chaotic and that there is a certain amount of things failing, that kind of international rule book order is failing, but at the same time, I think there is a deep sense that many people know there's something not right with the world, and are deeply committed to try and better the world. And that gives me a bit of hope. And new monasticism is a form of that, I think. Mm.
Hmm. Well, we've been chatting for a while. We've almost figured out uh, how to save the world from collapse, I think. It has something to do with Dune and crying. I'll watch Dune and I'll cry, and it'll all come together. Um, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add or anything that
No,
you felt tickling your heart, but
no, I think what I always feel very encouraged about, and how you have talked about some very important writers, um, of the kind of patristic period, and I think there's something about I think it's making me remember to lean into the patristics a lot more, the desert mothers and fathers, and there were mothers, not just fathers, that we need to engage with, uh, and you just making me think, yeah, I need to do more of that. I think I was doing that for a while until recently, but then I got caught up with this PhD with having to engage with more modern theologians, and I think no, I'd like to go back and go back. I want to go and read a bit more Cassian, for example. I don't know him so well. I know him a bit, but not as well as some of the others. So yeah, I'm excited about the commitment to go and look at some of that work. Mm.
well, if you're going for Cassian, do conferences 9 and 10 with Abba Moses.
Right, we'll
Yeah,
do. We'll do. We'll do.
yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ian. Maybe next time I'm in Hamilton, which I am periodically,
Yeah, let me know.
I'll
Yeah,
let you know, and we'll come by your cathedral and we'll meditate,
yeah,
and
that'd
then
be great.
we'll have a tea or a beer or whatever it
Yeah,
is. Yeah.
more than happy. More than happy. That'd be great. Thank you, Justin.
All right.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy your evening and wrapping up from the holidays and getting back into the swing of regular life. But
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
okay, take care.
Bye bye.